You're listening to Leading Up with Udemy. This podcast is your guide to developing your skills as an emerging or seasoned leader. I'm Alan Todd, your host and the Vice President of Leadership Development at Udemy. Together, we can work, lead, and live differently to create a better world. This week, I'm speaking with Alan Murray, the president of Dow Jones Leadership Institute. He was previously the CEO of Fortune magazine, where he spent the past 10 years. He joined the Wall Street Journal in 1983 and became bureau chief within 10 years. During his tenure as bureau chief, his team won 3 Pulitzer Prizes, as well as many other awards. He went on to become the journal's deputy managing editor, helping to remake the organization in the wake of technical disruption to the entire media landscape. Alan has several best-selling books, including Revolt in the Boardroom, The New Rules of Power in Corporate America, The Wealth of Choices, How the New Economy Puts Power in Your Hands and Money in Your Pocket, and recently, Tomorrow's Capitalist, My Search for the Soul of Business. Today, we'll dive into his journey, his insights on the future of capitalism, and what it takes to lead in an ever-changing world. I was super excited to have Alan Murray on the podcast this week. I really like how he navigated the changing landscape of the media industry to adapt to a rapidly digitizing world. You will learn how to control your destiny during a technical revolution. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Alan. It's great to be with you. And thanks for all you do.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. So, Alan, first question. You've had this remarkable career, which we just kind of highlighted a little bit. When you were a little kid, what did you think you wanted to become?
This all started when I was too young to even think clearly about it. I began my journalism career at the age of 9. I would walk up and down the neighborhood street and ask people about their visiting grandparents or their lost dog or somebody wanted to swim meet, and I would make my poor mother type it all up using a special carbon paper, and I could run that. This is obviously before the age, not just before the age of the internet, it was before the age of omnipresent Xerox machines. And so my mother would type it up on some special carbon paper, and I had a jelly sheet mimeograph machine that could run off 30 copies, and I sold them for a nickel a piece. So I've been doing this since I was too young to think clearly about it. I edited my high school newspaper, my college newspaper, and I was kind of stuck after that.
So it seems like it was born into you.
I think so. And obviously, it's been a challenging period for the journalism business, but it's great for the kind of career you've had for constantly learning. You face something new every day. You're always presented with new situations and new challenges. And so I've loved it. I have no regrets about the fact that I made that decision at the age of 9.
Yeah, and we'll unpack some other things, but I'm curious, like people that are searching for their passion and their purpose, did it happen in an instant at 9, or is this something that evolved where it kept growing inside of you? Because like you said, even high school, then your college choice of major in English and so on.
Well, it kind of happened at 9 and I liked it and I kept getting opportunities. I mean, even my elementary school principal said, if we had a newspaper, you would have run it. And so I had a period in college where I said, this is just crazy, right? You can't make a rational decision about your life when you're 9 years old, and spent maybe a year thinking about doing other things, but eventually ended up back doing it because I loved it.
Yeah. And I think so many people, when they're trying to figure that out, figure out what you love and what you're good at. You said something that you didn't set out to change the world. You set out to explain the world. And I'm curious with your career, what has that taught you?
Look, that was always part of my conception of the purpose of journalism, was to help people understand what's going on. And those were the days where there were actually standards, professional standards, and people, taught you a certain way to go about your job. And you were taught that this isn't about your mission, your cause. This is about your commitment to try and getting as close to the truth as humanly possible. And so that was very much the way I entered the business. And even later in my career, when I began to realize that the rules of leadership were changing and that there was a much greater focus on social impact than there had been before, I came at that conclusion not because I believed it was the right thing to do, but because I was hearing very different stories being told to me by the people who were running large organizations. So I have probably reached the point where I do have a clear mission, but I reached that mission through journalism, through asking questions, trying to get closer to the truth, trying to understand how business operates today.
And you said getting to the truth twice, which gets to the importance of that and journalistic integrity. And I'm curious, what's your take on just in the world today with journalism, ideological points of view, trying to prove points, and celebrity journalism? It seems to be isn't necessarily always the case the way you described it.
Yeah, well, sadly, it's become a mess. It's a mess. And it's a mess partly because anyone can do it. When I began my career, there was a pretty small group of people who had control over the information that got to you every day. You know, there were a couple of big newspapers and a couple of wire services, and there were problems with that. Those people probably spent too much time having drinks together after work and developed a kind of a unified worldview that shut out alternatives. So I totally get the people who say that was too much control over information. But we've now gone to the other extreme. Anybody with a smartphone or a computer can be a journalist. There are no professional standards. There's no entry exam. No one is credentialing you. And as a result, there are no standards. It's become wide open. When I hear people today say, oh, the media does this and the media should stop doing that, I say, well, what media are you talking about? Because everybody is a journalist. And as a result, it's impossible to enforce any kind of common practice or standard. So I think it's a real problem.
Yeah, and that's today's world. So let's go back to your early career. So you get started at the Wall Street Journal. What was that experience like, and how did that shape your leadership? Because you started as a reporter and you end up running the place, editorially speaking.
Look, the Wall Street Journal was and still is a great newspaper. I think it's the best newspaper in the United States. I think it's the only newspaper that's trusted on both sides of the great political divide that we live with today. And there are lots of polls that show that. So I'm delighted. I started my career there doing economic coverage, but then rose up to become the Washington bureau chief. There we do have standards. We did have training. I worked for a great man. I was hired by Al Hunt, who preceded me as Washington bureau chief, but I worked very closely with Paul Steiger, who was the managing editor for many years, a man of enormous integrity, who had a great career in journalism. And that's where I learned the craft.
And how about the difference between print and TV journalism? So back in those days, you also at some point went to CNBC and you worked in television. This is before Fortune Now.
That was after 9/11. You know, listeners who've been around for a while will remember that before 9/11, CNBC was kind of a day trader's service. It was just like totally focused on the market and market movements, and people doing trading all day long were glued to the screen. And after 9/11, CNBC correctly made the conclusion that they needed a broader view of the world, and they wanted a Washington bureau chief to help bring that. And so they hired me and had me do a nightly television show. And Alan, for 3 years, I dedicated myself to the notion that you can do a Wall Street Journal type news show in the evening cable market. My conclusion after 3 years is you can't. I mean, if there's big news, then everybody turns on the TV and they watches you. So that was during the Iraq War. We had great ratings during the war because we got all the generals on. We got the top administration officials. We covered both sides of the story. We did all the things I was taught to do at the Wall Street Journal. And people wanted that because there was news every night. And so they watched. But as soon as the big news story goes away, and the cable networks still have a mandate to get people to watch, it stops being a news platform and becomes an entertainment platform. And anybody who watches cable news today realizes that cable news is about personalities and entertainment and exciting your passions as opposed to providing you a source of news. So that's why I ultimately left television in 1995 and went back to the Wall Street Journal, because I came to the conclusion that cable news could not, because of its economic model, could not host a credible news show. And I think that conclusion is right. It's been 20 years and they still haven't done it.
What does that say about the difference between someone who watches TV news and one who reads a newspaper. And I'm thinking Marshall McLuhan famously said, the medium is the message. Is the medium the message? Is the customer base different between those two media?
Definitely the customer base is profoundly different. I mean, look, linear television is just not a very good way, in my opinion, it's not a very good way of delivering news. It's inefficient. You have to sit there for an hour to get through the whole thing, and you may have to spend a lot of time listening to stories you don't care about to get to the stories you do care about. When you're reading the newspaper or when you're online, when you're on your smartphone, you pick and choose the stuff that you want to dive into deeply. You can't do that in linear television. You have to sit through everything. And as a result, to keep viewers, they have to turn to entertainment. And that's what they do. So I think people who are watching, a cable news show for hours on end in the evening are looking for something different than straight news and information. They're looking for something that inspires them, that strikes their heart, that hits their passions, that both entertains them and gives them a sense of belonging.
So I think it was 1980, 79 or 80, Neil Postman wrote Amusing Ourselves to Death.
Yes.
And what you're describing is putting that argument into my head. And I'm wondering, what does that mean? Like, I'm thinking now, our listeners are early career, rising stars, aspiring future leaders. And we look at the research on being distracted and we're amusing ourselves to death. And there are quite negative consequences for doing such a thing. How do we stop that?
Yeah, I don't know that you can stop it. I have nothing against television. I amuse myself with television often. There are lots of Netflix series I like to follow. I just think it's a lousy way for people to get news. And of course, when I say today's news environment has become a mess, yeah, it started with that cable phenomena that we've been talking about, but that was magnified many times over by social media. I mean, I spent a couple of years of my career running the Pew Research Center. This would have been about 12 years ago, 13 years ago. And we did a big study at the time. That was the first study that showed a majority of Americans were getting their news from Facebook. And you think about that. I mean, who's determining what they read? Well, it's determined by some algorithm whose goal is not to make sure you're well informed. Its goal is to make sure you're engaged, you're entertained. So basically, it created a news market where you could get whatever news you wanted, whatever news you showed that would pull you in. They would deliver you that news. And it didn't matter if it was created by Russian bot or paid special interests or crazed people who had no respect for the truth. So I think cable certainly started it, but social media has taken it much farther. The late, great Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan said, you're entitled to your own opinions, but not to your own facts. Well, social media has created a world where everyone seems to believe they are entitled to their own facts.
So let's assume social media has exploded. There's no journalistic standards, and everybody in the whole world that has a $200 laptop can produce a podcast, TV, news, movies, documentaries. They can produce everything. How would you advise someone early in their career right now? And we talk about distraction, and there's entertainment, which is great, but where do you get the fortitude and the discipline to, at some point, shut off the entertainment and go deep into your thinking and reflecting and reading?
I think we have to do a better job training people to be news consumers. I mean, when I read something on my smartphone, there are a series of things I go through in my mind. First of all, where is this published? Is it published on a platform that corrects its errors? Is it published on a platform that has a history of reporting on both sides or all sides of a story? Is there any indication in the story itself that the writer tried to reach out and get comment from other sides? We were trained to do that at the Wall Street Journal. That's the way I was brought up. And you can pretty quickly tell when you're reading a story whether the writer has done that. So there are a series of checks like that you can go through to decide, is this something I can trust or isn't it? I do that routinely because I'm a journalist. I think smart readers will do that. But unfortunately, that kind of news literacy is not a broad public skill, and we probably need to make it one as long as we're going to live in this world where you can get whatever news you want whenever you want.
Yeah, that sounds important. I think sometimes if I have this discussion with people that are in the education field, they'll say, well, we teach critical thinking. And it strikes me that people are not critically thinking. So whatever we've been teaching for a long time, it doesn't seem to work for today's world.
Yeah, and there are things, there are outfits that attempt to do that in the schools. Stephen Brill and Gordon Krovitz created something called NewsGuard that's kind of like a good housekeeping seal of approval that does the same kind of checklist that I would do and then says, you can trust this. This rates well on our scale, or this doesn't rate well on our scale. It hasn't gotten into widespread use yet, but I think that's the kind of thing. And frankly, there's no particular reason why AI couldn't provide that sort of service. Give us hey, you should watch out for the veracity of what you're reading here for the following reasons, or you can trust the veracity of what you're reading here for the following reasons.
So as you talk about the explosion of social media, let's go back to your days as a managing editor, and the world is changing the media industry, right? So newspapers are like almost becoming irrelevant overnight. And so I'm curious, how did you balance journalistic integrity with the need to make money and survive?
Well, that's really what I've spent the last 20 years of my career on. When I left CNBC and came back to the Wall Street Journal, Paul Steiger, who was then the managing editor, said, I want you to write a column on business, write a column for CEOs, look at the world the way CEOs have to, where you integrate politics, economics, business all into one worldview. And I said, I'll do that, but I'd like to go spend the summer. Stanford University has a great senior executives program. I said, I'd like to spend the summer at Stanford and take this program. And it was great. It was a wonderful summer. But what was really great about the program was it's all geared to have you analyze the problems in your own industry. And by 2005, it was already clear what was happening to the media industry. 2000 was kind of the peak for print advertising. I think the Wall Street Journal had $1 billion in print advertising that year. Fortune had, almost 100 times what it has now, or 50 times what it has now in the year 2000. So you could already see it was sort of declining 10% a year. You could already see that the introduction of computers and search engines, Google, people just weren't using print, and advertisers didn't need print to reach their audience. They had much cheaper ways they could reach the audience they wanted. And so they were leaving print behind. And that decline continued for 20 years. It was already clear. And so I spent a lot of that summer at Stanford saying, okay, how can it be that the Wall Street Journal, which provides quality business information, is steadily going downhill when other business information services, Bloomberg, Gartner, Forrester, were making money hand over fist? And when I got back to the Journal, really my career since then has been dedicated to figuring out how do you open up new streams of revenue that can protect these important news institutions. And that's what I did at the Journal, and that's what I did for 10 years at Fortune, with some success, I think.
Yeah. So in an environment where people are struggling, let's just say in the media industry, I suppose you went through downsizings, layoffs, divestitures, whatever. So you've seen all of it. How do you foster a culture of innovation and change and learning in the midst of that?
Well, it's the right question, right? Culture change was the big challenge. You think about Fortune. Fortune was a print magazine where the journalists would write a 5,000-word story once a month or once every 2 months. And when I got there 10 years ago, I said, hey, guys, this is not the way the game works anymore. You have to write, 300 words twice a day, 3 times a day. That's a huge culture change. And there was enormous resistance. People use the word quality a lot, the assumption being that if I write 5,000 words, it's quality, but if I write 300 words, it's not. And, I spent 10 years writing 300 words at the top of a daily newsletter, the CEO Daily from Fortune. I actually started doing that as an exercise in culture change because I wanted to show my people, you can be smart in 300 words. And furthermore, you have time in your day to do this. You have lots of experience, and I'm going to prove that by doing it myself.
So you became the change that you sought. That's a Gandhi principle, be the change you seek in the world. So that's a good one.
I like that.
But I'm curious, did everyone just completely change in the culture and everyone learned? Or is there people that get it and people that do not wish to change? Like, exactly what did you see happen with people?
It's so hard. There were clearly people who didn't get it and had to leave. There were people who we told to leave because the economics just didn't support them all anymore. But then what really surprised me was even as you hired a new generation of reporters who had begun as digital reporters at some other place, the culture stuck. And so you had these people that spent their whole career as digital reporters and they show up at Fortune and suddenly they think the highest calling is to write 5,000 words for the magazine. And said, no, wait a minute, that's what's dying here. That's what we have to get away from. And let me say, just as an aside, Alan, it's not that I don't think there is a place for 5,000 word magazine stories. There is. And on weekends, I will frequently read 3 or 4 of them. But the bar is high. And the amount of time that people devote to that kind of consumption is pretty small. So it can't be what everybody aspires to. So it was really hard. And it took much longer than I ever would have imagined. I mean, as I said, I was there for 10 years. I would say really only 2 or 3 years ago was I able to look at the organization and say, oh, we've crossed the chasm. We finally made it. These people are digital journalists. They're not holding up the old print magazine. So, you're talking 6 or 7 years. Shame on me for not making it happen quicker. But I'll give you an example of a mistake. One of the things I did in the early years when we were still part of Time Inc., and this was clear to me, I said, I'm going to outsource this problem because Time magazine actually crossed much earlier than Fortune did. And they had a guy named Edward Felsenthal who ultimately became the editor and then the CEO. But at the time, he was the digital editor who understood how to do this and had created a really sharp digital news team. And I said, well, great. I'm going to take a group of my reporters and just give them to Edward and say, hey, do business news. Take these people and do business news. And it worked very well until the day came 5 years ago when Time Inc. was sold to Meredith, and Meredith sold Time and Fortune off to 2 different people, and we split. And all of a sudden, my great scheme for outsourcing my problem went away, and I realized that the culture problem at Fortune had not gone away.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it took that long for you to change the culture of where you're outsourcing, not controlling your destiny, whereas I suppose what your reflection on that is that you would have preferred to have built that capability and nurtured it in-house.
I should have done the hard work of culture change then, and instead I just outsourced my problem. And yes, in retrospect, it was a mistake because when we split 5 years ago, my problem was still there.
And other than that, what would you have done sooner or faster to lead breakthrough change?
This is a painful thing to say, but I have heard so many CEOs say it after they step down from their job. Move faster on personnel. They're just people who aren't getting it, and you need to take the action. And the reason that we don't is because we're human beings, and these are good people, and they're hardworking people. But I've heard it so many times, and now I'll add my voice to the pile. And because they are human beings, our successors will not listen to us. But when you see somebody who's not working out, move fast.
I'll underscore that with one of my colleagues. Dave Pottruck was the CEO of Charles Schwab, and he was on the podcast. So Dave. So Dave and I, he was the chairman of my last company, CorpU. And Dave says, what's your one big regret as the CEO? And it was 2001 .com crash, switched to a more electronic trading. And I didn't move fast enough on the people stuff. And it cost me my job. He said, I'm done, CEO.
I've heard that so many times. I think it's a universal truth and will probably remain a universal truth because we will continue to be human beings.
Yeah, which is why I really appreciate your comment that our listeners, when they are the next captains of industry, will go on to make the exact same mistake and regret that same thing 10 or 15 years from now.
Yeah, maybe they'll be a little faster because they listen to your podcast.
So what is the lesson that a younger, early career person could take today, the ones that got it, that changed the culture? So now not from the CEO perspective or the top down, but the bottom up. How do I stay relevant in my career and make sure I have a job through the next pivot and the next pivot and the next pivot?
Yeah, you just have to embrace change. I mean, we're at a very interesting moment for that, to talk about that right now. You have to be willing to embrace change. You have to be skeptical whenever you hear someone say, that's not the way we do things. Now, why do I say we're at an interesting moment? I mean, you have, for people in my profession, your profession, you have this incredible tool that popped onto the scene in November of 2022. And I don't know who said this first, but they should be given an award for coining the right phrase for the moment. Someone said, there's all this angst about I'm going to lose my job to AI. And somebody said, you're not going to lose your job to AI. You're going to lose your job to somebody who knows how to use AI. Embrace the moment, embrace the tool, use the tool so you understand it. And if you understand it, you're going to be in hot demand for the next 20 years.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. As we think about technology and technical evolution, again, I'll quote Neil Postman one more time. He said that the advance of scientific technology should be a branch of moral philosophy, not of science. And by that, I would love to bridge that comment that the world's changing, Gen AI is coming. So to adapt to that business world that you just quite eloquently described, what are the new leadership skills that might rise in importance that you think now people have to learn, practice, or behave?
Yeah, well, to put it at its most simple level, leadership of these large organizations today is much less about telling people what to do and much more about engaging them, giving them a vision, giving them a purpose, a North Star, and sort of giving them guardrails. The speed of change is another piece of this. In this dematerialized world, things can happen very quickly. Google came out of nowhere. Facebook came out of nowhere. These things can grow like wildfire, and the world moves very rapidly. And you can no longer run a company the way you did in 1975, where you had people out in the field and they'd collect all the information and they'd pass it up to the people in the C-suite and they'd sit in a room and come up with a strategy and then they'd tell everybody what to do. Well, any company that operates that way today will die because things are moving too fast. And so you have to push power and decision-making out into the field. And that leaves the folks at the top responsible for motivating, engaging, setting guardrails, setting values, making sure your people who are making the decisions in the field are doing the right thing. The problem Wells Fargo ran into is a great example of when you fail to do that. And so leadership just becomes very different and a much more human exercise.
So you've had access to the world's greatest leaders. You've interviewed, met with, spent 4 decades. Is there anyone who stood out or any particular skill that you see that you admire?
There are lots of people who stand out. I've mentioned a couple already. Donahoe at Nike, even though he's going through a tough patch right now. Mary Barra at GM, even though she's going through a tough patch right now. I think one of the most outstanding examples, the one that I like to cite today, is Doug McMillon at Walmart, who is not anyone's definition of a woke CEO. I mean, he grew up in Arkansas, started working loading trucks, but he understands this, I think, better than most. And he's in a hell of a fight. I think most of us would have predicted 20 years ago that Walmart would diminish relative to Amazon. And
right.
The Fortune Global 500 list just came out yesterday, and Walmart's still bigger than Amazon in terms of total revenues. But he's done that by saying we have to connect with the hearts as well as the minds and the wallets of our customers. I think he's a pretty outstanding example. I could go on for a long time, but maybe I'll just encourage people to read the book, Tomorrow's Capitalist.
Yeah. Well, I love the book, Tomorrow's Capitalist. Can you make an argument? You went to London School of Economics, you studied economics, you wrote a book about capitalism. Make the argument for our listener whose early career does not have a business degree. What do they need to know about economics and capitalism in order to have a successful business career?
And that's another driver of the trends we've been talking about. The biggest changes in the world come from the private sector. I mean, wars are maybe created by governments, but positive change is usually driven by the private sector. And that's what I concluded back when I was coming out of school. And I think it's still true that if you want to understand how positive change happens in our society, you better understand business and what drives business and how business creates value.
I think people should go out and read Tomorrow's Capitalist to understand your search for the soul of business. So, Alan, one question that we ask everyone on the podcast, what are you curious about and learning now?
Well, I'm on sabbatical. I'm between jobs, so I'm doing an enormous amount of reading, but the top of the list is AI. I'm both playing with it, experimenting with it, reading about it, because I think this is going to be one of the things that changes the world in profound ways, positive and negative. And all of us need to get our heads around it to make sure that the positive outweighs the negative.
Which goes back to the point about moral philosophy. We had a professor on from NYU who talked about, basically, he's a machine learning AI expert. And he said, I think business executives should read philosophy books if they want to take advantage of AI. I just thought that was an interesting point of view.
Love it. Love it.
All right, Alan, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Well, thank you for a fascinating conversation. Great to be with you, and thanks for giving me the time.
Thanks again to Alan Murray for joining me on the podcast today. Follow Leading Up, a podcast from Udemy Business, wherever you find your podcasts. We'll be back next Wednesday with another episode to help you level up your leadership skills. Follow the show so you never miss an episode. And if you like the show, leave a rating or a review. We'd love the feedback, and it really helps us to find new listeners. To learn more about Leading Up or how Udemy can help you develop leaders at scale and move business forward, visit business.udemy.com. The Leading Up podcast is produced in partnership with Pod People. Our original theme is by Soundboard.